Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tate Modern. My name is Sonia Dyer, and I'm one of a team of public programs curators working across the Tate. And it gives me great pleasure to present tonight's event, which is the sixth in the American Artist Lecture Series featuring Glenn Ligon. Previous discussions in this series have featured Bryce Marden, Maya Lin, Richard Tuttle, Spencer Finch, and Julie Moretti. The series is a collaboration between Art in Embassies, the US Embassy in London, and Tate, and it seeks to bring the greatest living modern artists, American artists, to the UK. Before we begin, just a few acknowledgements to thank the people who made tonight possible. Firstly, we'd like to thank Matthew Barzan, the US Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and his wife, Brooke Barzan. Thanks to Virginia Shaw, Chief Curator at the US Department of State, Office of Art in Embassies, and to curator Velmut Landstra from Art in Embassies. The series was initiated by Marjorie Sussman, the wife of the former US Ambassador to the UK, Louis B. Sussman. Now, I'm sure we are all familiar with Glenn Ligon's work. He's one of America's leading contemporary artists, perhaps best known for his now landmark series of paintings in which texts were written in black against white backgrounds. Ligon continues to explore subjects of race, language, desire, sexuality, identity in his work, whilst also utilizing a broad range of media from painting, drawing, print, photography, film, and sculptural installations, including his iconic neon reliefs. Ligon's work is characterized by a sharp examination of American history, culture, and its complex, ever-changing identity. He's also curated and features in the exhibition Encounters and Collision, currently at Nottingham Contemporary and set to transfer to Tate Liverpool, opening on the 30th of June. And if you get the opportunity to go to Nottingham or to Liverpool, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful show, incredibly intelligently and sympathetically curated with a brilliant catalogue. So tonight's format is a conversation between Glenn Ligon and leading fashion designer, curator, and his great friend, Duru Olowu, followed by questions from the audience. We are recording tonight, so we ask that when it comes to the Q&A section, if you can wait for the microphone to reach you, that will allow us to record your questions as well as any answers. Otherwise, it's a bit strange in the recording. We are expecting to have quite a busy house tonight, so you may need to, as we move along, kind of get closer together so we can get a few more people in. But I think that's it for now. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Virginia Shaw, who will continue with the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Hi, my name is Virginia Shaw. I'm the Chief Curator at Art in Embassies, which is a program within the United States Department of State. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and thank the Tate, because this is our sixth in the lecture series, which was supposed to be our final, but we're already working on what the next few lectures are going to be, so we're going to extend the series. It's been really incredible working with the Tate and working with Marco and Anna and everybody here, so thank you. I also wanted to say thank you to Brooke Barzan, who's been an incredible supporter of Art in Embassies and also helped us realize this project. A quick soundbite about Art in Embassies, just to give you some sense. Our program began in the 60s. Actually, it began in the 50s with the Museum of Modern Art, and then in the 60s, JFK made it a State Department program. But what we really want to focus on is the evolution of our program in the last decade. In the last decade, what we've been able to do is go from a loaned program of American art for all the ambassadors' residences to a program about cross-cultural exchange. So our program now, we're on a major building campaign after bombings in North Africa. We are rebuilding a significant number of our embassies and consulates, and with every one of those new buildings, we now oversee a percentage of the building costs, and that money goes toward art. And what we were able to do is expand the mission of the program, not to be just about American art, but to be about art from the host country as well as American art. So we've become a program about cross-cultural exchange and promoting artists from the host country as well as America. And And you may have seen the construction going on in Battersea, but in the next 2 years, we're speaking about being in London. We're going to have a new embassy opening here in 2 years. So we are right now amidst working with some incredible artists from the UK as well as the United States. And we have a lot more work to do, but in the next few years, you'll see some of your artists as well as American grace the walls and become basically the face of our embassy. The only other thing I wanted to say is we believe in the great quote that great civilizations are remembered for their cultural legacies, and that's what we're dedicated to doing. So on that note, what we've all come here for tonight, Glenn Ligon, a great partner to Art and Embassies, thank you. And Dora Alulu, thank you so much. Look forward to hearing your talk.
Hi, Glenn. Good evening, everyone, and it's great to be here.
Thank you for doing this,
No,
Dora.
I
This
was
is so above and beyond.
Yes, but
the
money
call.
will do anything, so it's fine. I know we've talked about in the introduction Glenn's body of work, but I think it's important to say once again that his work is represented in some of the greatest museum collections: the Tate, Modern, MoMA, Pompidou, the Whitney, and his retrospective in 2011 at the Whitney traveled to LACMA. He has his recent show is the curatorial show at the Nottingham Contemporary, but he had a wonderful show at Camden Arts last year. So without further ado, I'm going to start asking Glenn questions about a bit about his work and the background of his work over the last 2 decades, but also about something which is very dear to me and which I discovered is very dear to him, which is fabrics and things that inspire him. So Glenn, can you tell us about your artistic practice over the last 2 decades?
Well, we have this image of a coal dust painting, which uses a text by James Baldwin. So many people might be familiar with this body of work. And I would say basically my work for the last, oh my God, I'm so old. I was just thinking, the last 20 years, but I have to add a 10 to that, the last 30 years or so, has been a sort of text-based practice in a variety of medium, painting, neon, prints, some film work, but all sort of centered around sort of text in some way or the other. So this was an important series to me because, one, because of Baldwin's and his writings, but two, it was sort of, it's been an ongoing investigation. There's this series of paintings has continued for a number of years. And so, and it's led to other ways of thinking about text. So maybe if we could have the next image.
Thank you. This is from the Come Out series.
Come Out series, yeah. Exactly. And this actually had a sort of strange genesis. I was working with a group of students from the University of Pennsylvania who were doing a course, a curatorial course, and the curatorial course is organized around picking one artist and studying their work and doing an exhibition at the ICA Philadelphia. And they approached me to do this, and I thought, okay, sure. But what are you going to talk about for a whole semester? But they somehow thought there was enough to talk about for a whole semester. And they did a studio visit, and, the sort of lull at the end of a studio visit where you're kind of like not sure what to ask anymore. And someone asked, well, what are you listening to? And I said, I've been really thinking about Steve Reich again, and I've been listening to this composition from 1966 called Come Out.
Could you explain who Steve Reich is?
Steve Reich, minimalist composer, though he hates that word. Very, very influential, sort of contemporary Philip Glass, but fantastic composer. And in the early 60s, he starts working with taped speech. So there's a very famous song he did, I think maybe in 65 or 64, called It's Gonna Rain, where he's done a field recording. He's recorded a black preacher on the streets in San Francisco and sort of takes that recording and loops it so that it creates this incredible kind of, almost like drumming, you know, except with just this voice. So in '66, he's asked to do a composition for a benefit concert. And the benefit is for a group of teenagers called the Harlem Six, who in 1964 in Harlem were basically rounded up by the police, accused of a murder of a shopkeeper in Harlem, taken to the police station, beaten, held without access to lawyers, etc. And it becomes a very sort of well-known case, a lot of interest from the civil rights community around this case. James Baldwin in 1966 writes an essay called A Report from an Occupied Territory that's based on this case. So a benefit concert is organized for these kids for their legal defense fund, and Steve Reich is asked to do a song at this concert. Yeah. And, you know, Steve Reich at that point doesn't do songs, you know. But he becomes very interested in the testimony from these 6 kids, and there is a taped testimony. Each of these kids has sort of told their story. And so Steve Reich listens to this testimony, and he focuses on one particular kid, Daniel Hamm, who says when he was in the police station, he had been beaten, but he wasn't bleeding. So they wouldn't take him to the hospital because he wasn't obviously injured. So Daniel Hamm, in this tape testimony, says, I had to open the bruise up to let some of the bruised blood come out to show them that I'd been beaten by the police. And Reich focuses on that little fragment of his testimony, I had to open the bruise up. But particularly, he focuses on come out to show them. And he puts that come out to show them on 2 tape loops and sort of lets them run simultaneously. But, you know, they're running on tape recorders, it's analog, and the tape recorders run at slightly different speeds, and the sound sort of goes out of sync. So it starts in sync and then goes out of sync. And then he doubles that, so there are 4 voices going, and he doubles that, and there are 8. So, and because all the voices are going out of sync, this very clear sentence, come out to show them, come out to show them, that's being repeated, starts to overlap and turn into a kind of abstraction. So, a long explanation to say, when these students asked me what I was listening to, I said I was listening to this. And most of them hadn't heard it before, so I played it for them. And then when I was thinking about it, I thought, oh, this is so interesting. This is a voice from a particular sort of charged moment in American history, a particular sort of, you know, moment in our social history or political history, African-American voice, taken by repetition to abstraction. That's my work. Yeah. You know, all of my early paintings are about that. But it had never occurred to me to use a composition like that as the basis of work. Oh, right. And so that sort of launched that ship, you know. So basically I decided to do these as silk screens instead of using oil stick and coal dust, which was the earlier painting. And just making silk screens and doing a very simple thing where I take text and use one silk screen that has justified text, the margins are even on both sides, and one silk screen that had left justified text, so the margins are ragged on one side, and just screening them over top of one another. And by that kind of process of screening over and over again, and misregistering, and maybe we could have the next painting. Yeah, we could have the next painting. This is, if I may point out, one of these works is actually part of the recent Tate acquisition. The work on the right. Right. But this was a view of the show at Thomas Dane Gallery, and this was the first, here in London, it was the first iteration of these paintings, and they're 20 feet long, and so there are a lot of things going on in these paintings. One is the idea of using this repetition, silkscreen, moving away in some ways from handmade oil stick paintings, which I had been doing. The other was the size of these are the biggest paintings I had made, and it was really important to me in terms of the size to sort of surround, you know, in a weird way, like the wall of sound. I was thinking about, you know, this sort of term from, you know, sort of music production about this sort of wave of sound that comes over you and fills a space. I was thinking about that, but also I was thinking about how do you talk about repetition and duration and sort of point to music, and part of that is the scale of these paintings, you know. And the one in the back is very, very dense, and it's just been silkscreened many, many times, and so it goes to black. Maybe we could have the next.
The close-up, yeah.
And this is a close-up of the surface of one of the paintings. And you can see that it's a very handmade process. It's silkscreen is sort of semi-mechanical, but you know, I was there when all these paintings were made. This one actually was very funny because they misregistered the screen, so that's why it's not quite straight. You know, if you see those two lines, they don't quite match up. And they're like, oh, well, that's a mistake, but on the next pass, we can fix that. We'll cover that over, and you won't see it. And I thought, like the mistake, you know? So a lot of my process is about sort of going with the mistake of something. And that was interesting to think about in relationship to Steve Reich, because when he first started using these sort of taped speech things, realizing that the machines would go out of sync was a mistake.
But it worked.
But he understood it as something that could generate some really interesting possibilities. Could we have the next? Maybe?
Can I just ask, what do you think that this new process has lent to the visual density of your work, which I think has changed as a result?
Well, you know, what's interesting about it is that density in my work was always about impasto, about building up layers. And this is about building up layers too, except these are very flat surfaces. So the building up of layers that happens is by the sort of density of layering this silkscreen ink, you know, image, text over one another. But the surfaces are quite flat, you know. And it was a kind of revelation to me to think about, you know, kind of visual density in that way, where it wasn't about the sort of, you know, impasto of the surface, about building up. And the impasto of the surface of the coal dust paintings was about using Baldwin's text and, you know, the density of his words and having a kind of correspondence between the density of the text and the density of his speaking style, writing style. And this felt like it needed to be, at first I started actually thinking about these as, you know, coal dust paintings or oil stick paintings, and then I realized, no, it has to be a more mechanical process. And silkscreen is kind of old, you know, it's kind of like digital has replaced it for a lot of people. So this is a kind of old technology. It's old school, exactly. It's artisanal.
Is this an installation shot from Camden?
This is an installation shot from Camden Art Center show. So there were two big paintings. And this is a bigger painting. It's made of 4 parts, and it's 48 feet tall by 40 feet long. And you can see in the image there are things that happen that across the length of the painting, because we were moving the screens around. So the right side of the image has this sort of moray in it. So those dots are kind of this moray. But when I looked at it, I thought, oh, it's you know, thinking about the come out, the original composition, I was thinking like that slip between, you know, where he says bruise blood. You know, I was thinking about, I was looking at these dots and thinking, oh, it's almost like this sort of weird visualization of the idea of bruise, but it's really simply a moray pattern that's set up by overlapping the screens.
But the other visual effect, which at least, I mean, I as a viewer notice, is the real density of pattern coming through the painting, which is interesting for me. And could you just explain if that was conscious? Or?
Well, that, you know, I think there's always, as you said, we have many areas of overlap, but one of the areas of overlap is our interest in fabrics. You're a scholar of fabrics, and I am not. I just look.
I wouldn't say that.
No, I would say that. You know, I always get schooled.
Okay,
moving along. But you know, but I'm really interested in the kind of density that you can get in a flat textile. I'm interested in color, because very often, you know, most of my work does not use color, and I'm always inspired by and thinking about color in the fabrics. I'm thinking about symbolism, particularly when looking at African fabrics and how the abstraction is symbolic, you know. because I always feel like I don't make abstract paintings. I make paintings that have texts that go towards abstraction.
But more antique, mid-20th, early to mid-20th century.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But also this kind of repetition
Yeah.
too. You know, fabric patterns are about a kind of repetition, and
Yeah.
a lot of my work is about a kind of repetition. Maybe we have the next. I don't
image.
remember what's up.
And it's interesting because in using silk screens to make a pattern, you do have to get to this point where there's a repeat, but an invisible repeat.
Right.
So in your case, the repeat is is obvious, but that's part of the visual impact you want.
Right.
This is a Yoruba textile, indigo textile, all with significant patterns on it, patterns that signify various things. And it's about early 20th century indigo from Abeokuta, a certain part that really mastered the art of this textile. And it's interesting because there's a Japanese comparison, but it's very interesting how that works. Could you tell us what you found useful or inspiring in a textile like this?
Well, first that it's handmade, and there's an embrace of difference. You know, there are motifs that repeat in there, certainly, like that sort of sun starburst.
Yeah.
But each panel is different, and that's kind of the way I work too.
Yeah.
You know, even when I'm working with silk screen, it's the same screen, but the pressure changes when you're printing it. It misregisters. So each, you can see every 2 by 4 foot silkscreen panel, but the one next to it is going to be different, and I sort of embrace that kind of difference in the work. That makes it sort of visually exciting. And also I just love the way there's a grid, but it's funky, it doesn't quite all line up. And that kind of embracing of sort of the imperfect, the accidental, the improvisational. Yeah, exactly.
Can we see the next
the next.
image?
That's
another one.
Yeah.
And maybe the next image, just as a variation. This is woven. The other one is more, it's printed, hand blocked. This is woven ashoke fabric, Yoruba again, silk and cotton, mid-20th. The thing about this fabric is it's actually woven by hand, usually by women, on a very narrow loom, and then the strips are later sewn together by hand.
Right.
Did that process, were you aware of this, and did that
that's what I was thinking about in terms of the come out paintings. Originally, I was going to do this, like literally make 2 by 4 foot sections, strips, and then put them together. And I thought that was too hard in a way, just technically.
How?
Technically. I couldn't figure out quite how to do it. But also, I thought, well, Steve Reich is about these, taking two voices, doubling. So these paintings that I was making that have these sort of 4 rows of the text were kind of like this idea, So they're 4 strips, but they get joined together. Yeah. I was looking very carefully at these. So there's other work coming that's, sort of trying to develop this idea.
But the other thing is, sorry if I'm butting in, but the other thing is, most of these textiles were made to be worn.
Right.
So you get an element of movement in real life, or in contemporary life, or even at the time. You are creating canvases that are static and contained. How do you achieve the same sort of layered jacquard effect and get that contained movement in your canvases?
Well, I'm flattered that you say that.
Why are you flattered? It's true.
Okay, but it's not something that I was thinking about consciously, because often the way that I saw these fabrics were as flat textiles or museum displays. You wouldn't see them necessarily
worn,
as worn, exactly. But it was really interesting to me, in terms of what we talked before about imperfections. That sort of gives a sense of movement in these silk screens for me.
Can we see some others that just, again, this Ewe fabric, Cameroon. This is probably late 50s. Again, you see the inconsistencies, and there's another one that's after this, which is more gridded, but again, that sort of perfect imperfection.
Right. What I loved in this fabric is the color choices create this pattern, but they're not, you can't figure out a system.
No.
It really feels like...
Instinct.
Yeah, it's instinct. But how do you sustain that over... This is a very large textile, you know? And so the genius of putting these strips together to create this overall sense of it's one piece of fabric is kind of amazing to me. It's something that I was thinking about in terms of...
And do you think it has to do with the
paintings.
reason for creating this fabric? Do you think that adds to the intensity of the work and the artisanal skills involved? I mean, this could be toile de Jouy or an English tapestry. It is of that quality. But most of these things were made for a reason, ceremonial or to signify something. How does that play into your work? Obviously, we know the background to your painting you just talked about, but is that always a consideration?
Not in that strict sense. I know what you mean in terms of like, you know, different fabrics had different functions. You know, a certain fabric was made for, as you say, a ceremonial function, certain fabric was more everyday. You know, there are different traditions depending on the country. So I was looking at that, and I don't know if I could necessarily have a direct translation between that intentionality and paintings. But maybe as the work goes on, you know, maybe as, you know, because I think the work that's coming engages more directly with these fabrics. I'm not sure exactly how yet, you know, but it's percolating. It's
does it allow for patience? Is it necessary to be a patient artist when you're working, when you're thinking about these things and executing the work?
Well, yeah, because I think, you know, for me, I've been thinking about African fabrics for a long time, but the work nobody looking at my work would think that, you know. And so it's just about letting something percolate for as long as it needs to percolate. And when the Steve Reich came along, I thought, oh, this is a sort of strange tangential way to get into this more deeply. But, you know, if you think about Reich, his interest in African drumming, he studied in Africa, there's that, you know, but also this sort of notion of patterning in music in general, you know, that
classical
has a kind of correspondence between these kinds of textiles.
Can we see the next, please? I know you love this image because, again, the interesting thing, we discussed this, is that a lot of these woven textiles and a lot of these things that Glenn has referenced or used as inspiration are executed by women, which is a very interesting thing to me because is it something you can explain? These are the women, Sonika women, who are in Mauritania and Gambia, and they're the ones that paint the houses. They also, if we see the next image, they completely paint the indoor bits of their homes, completely. And so the men build the houses and then leave. And there's this idea that you're not only surrounded, you don't only see pattern on the outside, you live within pattern, which is I'm all for, you know. But in the context of your work, was that surround effect, like sound? Again,
That's certainly, I mean, this is a fantastic image because, you know, imagine these are sound waves, you know, and you're surrounded by this kind of visualization of sound. And that's one of the things I was certainly thinking about in terms of the rig. But also, I think, look at how beautifully painted these are, and sort of like, there's a gap, there's a doorway, but that pattern continues in such a beautiful way across that, And so it's super inspiring to see something like this, and also spark some ideas, you know. But this, you know, the notion of sort of this kind of surround, I think, you know, has a relationship to your curatorial practice. You've curated 2 shows. Can we have the next image?
This is, okay, this is unexpected. I thought we were going to G's band.
Oh, okay. No. The first one was called Material, was in the gallery in New York, and this sort of notion of the surround, of bringing all these things together, having a wallpaper, having a Sunufo statue, photographs, contemporary painting, sculpture, Sterling Ruby, Kathy Burkhardt, you know. So maybe you could talk about surround in terms of like thinking about curatorial.
Well, again, for
things.
me, it's more to do with I like things. You know, I'm a bit of a magpie, so it's more about just trying to get people to see what goes on in my head. For you, what I think would be interesting to know is for me, it's easy to translate this into my work. You know, for you, because it can be a sort of
You're being modest. It's
no,
not
but
easy.
well, that's what I do. You know, it's a collage of inspiration. But this idea of surround, if we could go to the next image, is very interesting. This is an Annie Alber's textile. Annie Alber's part of the Bauhaus movement, which is another thing we both talk about a lot, etc., which has links, you know, visually and in certain ways to the African textiles. So obviously, other people were looking at other things, and I think during that period, people were a lot more open to that. That strictness of the Bauhaus, though, contrasts with the fluidity of some of the other fabrics we saw.
Right.
Which would you rather achieve with your work?
Well, I think a bit of both. You know, I'm working within, you know, a tradition of painting that has some of its roots in this kind of material, you know, sort of thinking about it. But I also am quite interested in, like, you know, other traditions that sort of, and mixing them together. I mean, that's, you know, why I wanted to show an image of the curatorial projects you did, because I was very inspired when I saw that show and the show you curated after that by your ability to mix together, not only in the curatorial work, but in your clothing, things from very different, supposedly disparate, you know, traditions. And so and it was a sort of revelation for me, and it was part of the inspiration for the show I did at Nottingham. Because I think, you know, you as a designer, me as an artist, we have a kind of, you know, virtual museum in our heads where things are very close together.
Homes, Glenn,
or in our homes, where things are very close together, you know. But how do you manifest that, you know? And I think you manifest that in the clothing, but also in the curatorial projects. And my show in Nottingham manifested that in the museum space.
Having said that, though, with clothing, like I said earlier, the movement aspect helps a lot. Can we just see the next images, please? This is Gee's Bend quilts from Alabama. This is probably 1930s, which again is something you were looking at.
Right, a whole group still going of quilters in a very rural, poor community in Alabama. So these are practical objects, you know, they were, you know. Scraps. But what a feast of scraps, in a way, you know, like just thinking compositionally about how these things are put together. And these are not people that were looking at contemporary art, they're not going to museums, they're not looking at abstractions, you know, so they're fantastic images when you see, you know, sort of older photographs from 70s of people going to Gee's Bend and looking at these quilts, and they're hanging on clotheslines. They were used, you know, but it's kind of like the best, you know,
compositions.
And, the most amazing compositions. And I know these are things that you were looking at. These things I've certainly looked at. Can we?
And I think we can look at the next one.
Next slide.
Okay. We're only using this. Glenn insisted to illustrate the collage aspect.
Right.
Because in the earlier ones, in the early images, we were really talking about the woven aspect. And with my work, I do a lot of collaging of fabrics. Some of my prints, some old antique prints mixed in, European and couture fabrics, etc. Can we go to the next image, please? This is another Gee's Bend, which you like, which you're very fond of.
Because of those big elements, you know, those repeating squares, but then they're all off-center, they're all unique, you know. There's an incredible kind of sense of improvisation to. I mean, we haven't talked about music, and we could have organized this.
Talk,
I know that's another talk. So next year, when I'm back doing American lectures for the Tate Part 2, we can talk. We can just focus on music.
But there's a musical element to this, right?
Right. Can we have the next? Another one of Juro's creation, and it's sort of mix of fabrics. And then material, the second show that Juro did in New York. And again, a big influence on the project I did at Nottingham in terms of like bringing together all of one's influences in the same space. So, Nick Cave sound suit, one of your capes on the right, photography, Laurie Simmons.
Cindy Sherman, I think. And
Right.
Yeah, but again, from my point of view, I felt freer to do this because I'm a designer, so no one could accuse me of curating or placing things so close together or doing it wrongly. Was there that element of not fear, but were you cautious in your first curatorial debut?
Well, I think in some ways, yes, one does have a responsibility to the work, but in some ways, I think I had to get over my inhibitions about how, how these things fit in history, and sort of talk about the show more in terms of how these things fit together in my head.
Yeah.
So, my idealized version of the show at Nottingham would literally be all the work was touching, because that's what they feel like in my head. David Hammons is juxtaposed with
Bruce Nauman.
Bruce Nauman, which is juxtaposed with Boetti, and these things sort of, the title of the show is Encounters and Collisions. So it's about this kind of butting heads, and so it would have been fantastic to literalize that, not possible in a museum setting, because of various, lenders and things to let you put their things next to other things.
Which leads us, which leads us nicely into what I think is an amazing show. Right, really, it's super. I mean, if anyone hasn't seen the show in Nottingham, you really should. It's a real feast for the eyes and for the soul, and it is a very humble, I think, as an artist of your stature, very humbling experience, because you respect the work of these great artists. Some of your work is in this show, sitting alongside a lot of these great artists, Boetti, Warhol, Beaufort Delaney, Nauman, Linetti Adam-Wake. I mean, people who would normally probably never be curated together.
And that's one of the things, this Boetti tapestry is the title of the show, Encounters and Collisions. And Boetti, I think, was an important figure for me. There was a fantastic show here at the Tate
a couple of years ago
that Mark Goffrey did.
Yeah, amazing
but
show.
Boetti was really interesting to me because he set up systems and then let people operate in those systems. So there was always this kind of sense of like chance things could happen. The weavers who did these could choose the color. Could we have the next image maybe? So the Boetti map there, the story, unless I'm getting it wrong, I think is that the weavers who did that map had never really thought about had never thought about the color of the sea.
No.
They had pink thread, so they used pink.
And can we say where this was all done? It was done in Kabul, which Alejandro Boetti would visit. He even had a hotel there at one point.
Right.
And he would literally allow the weavers he would guide, show them the outlay, but they would be allowed to choose a lot of the
So Boetti
colors
was important in terms of the show, but of this sort of notion of like, you go someplace, you have an idea for something, and then you collaborate with someone. Things come together, and they come together in unexpected ways. And so the show was really about saying, okay, these are all the influences I've had.
Yeah.
Looking at this room, there's a Katie Nolan on the floor. Can we go back, sorry once? Katie Nolan on the floor, a piece that's based on, what's her name? Patty Hearst.
Patty Hearst.
There's a Richard Serra drawing. There's Felix Gonzalez Torres, Candy Still, USA Today, the Boetti map on Kawara. Can we have the next one? And then just going, clear the next, thanks. And then sort of going around the room with David Hammons, body print. Can we have the next image? And then My American Neon from the Tate. Joseph Boy's I Like America, America Likes Me on the monitor with the poster that was done in '74 for that piece. So it was about sort of like putting all these things that are in my head together in the physical space. But we had to organize them around categories to make them make sense in some ways for a viewer. So it wasn't just a nice group show with all these things in it that had no sort of underlying logic.
And how, can we see the next image? Because I think it's important. How, for example, do you think a lot of these, there's a certain harmony in the rooms, which is very hard to achieve when you have such disparate work. How did you achieve that? This is one of your early door paintings.
Right.
And a Robert Morris.
Robert Morris, the felt piece, and the Robert Gober, the little drain piece in the wall, and leading into a room with Steve McQueen's bear. You know, honestly, I made a model in my studio of the exhibition spaces at Nottingham. I made scale models of all the loans that we had for the show. And I placed them all very carefully in the spaces. And then when I got there, I thought, well, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. And so I really had to kind of find the rooms, you know? And in a way that's frustrating because you have this sort of set of like, this is all gonna work. And then you realize like, no, that's interesting actually because things can be in different dialogues. Can we have the next image? So this is, I don't know if this was a dialogue that was originally in the model, but I thought it was an interesting thing to put this sort of late Pollock next to the Morris, next to Gober's drain, next to this text painting. Part of these juxtapositions are visual and part of them are formal in some ways, but part of them are content-wise, you know. But I don't know if, as you said, these things would be in proximity, you know.
But were you cautious about or respectful about what you placed next to each other?
Yes, I mean, there's certain kinds of readings of work that I didn't want to, you know, over-determine by the kinds of juxtapositions. Can we have the next, maybe? That's a close-up of the door painting. Can we have the next? For instance, this piece is called Condition Report, and it is a painting based on, an image of a painting based on signs carried by striking sanitation workers in Memphis in '68.
But this is one of your pieces.
This is one of my pieces. So I based the painting on a sign being carried by these striking sanitation workers. And then I commissioned a friend who's a conservator to do a condition report on the painting. So all those marks of, you know, smudges and fingerprints and cracks and stuff are his condition report on the condition of this painting. But by extension, I think, condition of, you know, our ideas about masculinity, about the civil rights movement, or, you know, history, et cetera. Normally, it would make sense, you know, there's a part of the show that deals with, has images of civil rights protests and also images produced of and by the Black Panthers. This piece should seemingly go there. But can we have the next slide? But I decided, no, actually, this, you know, let's put this piece in juxtaposition with three artists, Lorna Simpson, Lynette, Zoe Leonard.
Lynette Yadom.
Yes.
And can I just say, is that that was a purchase? That's a Tate purchase, the Lorna Simpson images.
Right. So it's a piece called Photo Booth. Right. Zoe Leonard images from the early '90s of fashion shoots, and then Lynette's painting. And so the I Am a Man painting is there, and so it gets read in this as this sort of meditation on masculinity in the space of these various meditations on sort of, you know, Lorna Simpson's photo booth piece is mostly, I think, almost exclusively images of men. Zoe is
black models
sort of,
in the 70s and 80s,
and then Lynette, this sort of, I'm obsessed with this painting.
She knows, Glenn.
Yeah, okay.
But it's an interesting painting because of the fragility of the male pose.
Right.
You know, it's not a typical pose. Even with the old masters, that's not a typical pose in that painting.
So in terms of, you know, I was willing to let my work read differently because of this kinds of juxtaposition. And that was kind of exciting for me to think about, you know, just sort of, could we have the next, maybe? This is another coal dust painting that's in a room with, can we have the next?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
A Boetti in the vitrine, de Kooning, Valentine, the coal dust painting, a Jasper Johns painting with two balls, Bob Gober, newspaper stack, Naumann, flesh to white to black. I'm probably getting the title wrong. Franz Klein from the Tate's collection, and then on the side, 2 paintings by Buford Delaney. Now, this was a kind of interesting room. Franz Klein was a huge influence on me when I was a younger painter, you know, as all the abstract expressionists were. So that's why I wanted Pollock, Klein, de Kooning, fantastic loans to get. Can we have the next, maybe? But I also wanted to think about that work in relationship to someone like on the right, Buford Delaney, who's working in the mid-50s. He's moved from, he's an American painter, not as well known as he should be, but I think will be better known. Black American painter, moves to Paris in the 50s, very, you know, friends with all the sort of American modernists, but also friends with, when he moves to Paris, Jean Genet, Baldwin, Stein, you know, he's kind of, he's a seminal figure. So the painting, can we have the next? The 2 paintings I have to show, on the left, a painting from the mid-50s of James Baldwin, and on the right, a yellow abstraction from the same period. And I sort of wanted to put him next to Klein, because you would never see him next to Klein, even though, you know, the time periods are similar. But also to say that, you know, Delaney had to leave America, you know. America was not a nice place in the 1850s for an African-American artist. Well, yeah, in the 1950s, for not a happy time for our people right then. So he leaves and goes to Paris to have a sort of autonomy, a sort of freedom. And so I'm really inspired by that story, but also inspired by the fact that for me, he doesn't really make a separation between figuration and abstraction. No. They're kind of the same thing. Can we go to the next image? So this portrait of Baldwin is a kind of, you know, you look at his color sensibility, you look at the way, you know, he's not seated anywhere, you know, he's in this incredible field. And can we go to the next? And juxtapose that with these paintings that are about kind of all overness and light, you know. And I just wanted, you know, to put him next to Klein, but also put him next to a coal dust painting, because the coal dust paintings use James Baldwin, you know. And the coal dust paintings are also about light. So I'm looking at Delaney and thinking about light, even though they don't look, you know, my paintings don't look like Delaney, but, you know, Delaney and Baldwin are kind of these, you know, I don't know, queer godfathers for me. So it's kind of nice to put all the relatives in the room.
What
you
do
know?
you hope, nicely put, what do you think the show allows the viewer to do?
Well, I think it allows the viewer to see that artists don't come out of a vacuum, you know, that artists are deeply influenced by work of, you know, other generations. They're deeply influenced by the work of their generation. But also, for me, it was a way to bring in artists that I hadn't really thought through so much and also wanted to be in dialogue with. So there's a young artist, Jenny Jones, who's done incredible pieces using, what's it called? It's like the chords that you use for headphones, you know, so those thick black cords as sculptural elements. And Jenny's is an artist that I've come to fairly recently, but I thought, if I want to think more about her work, let me put it in this show, because that allows me to think more about her work.
It triggers something.
Yeah, it triggers something. Similarly, the Robert Morris, not an artist that I really studied, thought through in relationship to my practice, but just thinking about his work and the sort of like sculptural things on the wall, you know, I thought this is very, in some ways, related to my neon work, which is always, for me, about trying to make sculpture, you know. They felt like neons on the wall, and I kind of like, that's the only way I could approach it. Oh, it's text. It's not sculpture. But, you know, I let the transformers for the neon always be present, exposed, you know. So I've sort of like, it moves it towards this three-dimensionality, towards a sculptural thing.
And in Camden, you had color in the neons as well, which was interesting.
Right. So sort of thinking about Morris was a way to kind of think more about this sort of notion of like things that are attached to this, you know, wall, but also come out into space, you know.
So just to give people an opportunity to ask questions, what would you like to get from the kind of things you take into consideration when you're working on pieces or things that are around you, textiles like we've learned, work by other artists you respect. What is in the end, is it to inform what you're trying to communicate, or is it to inform your technique? What's the...
Well, I guess it's about trying to be a better artist, really. Trying to see what has been said and see how I can, move from there, move in a different direction, or incorporate, those ideas into the work, or think more clearly about them through sort of thinking more clearly about other people's work. But also, there, as I said, in relationship to the Morris, it's made me think differently about neon and what its possibilities are. Because in some ways, I've been very conservative. And so when I saw that piece, I thought, there's a lot
the next neon maybe like...
maybe lying on the floor.
Lying on the floor.
There we go.
In color.
I mean, that's an idea I've had for years. And I actually did a neon that lies on the floor for a show in LA. But it took me,
a while.
10 years to get to that.
That's okay.
If I'd seen that Morris and thought about it more carefully, I would have maybe gotten to that faster. But it's also about, I don't know, for me to make an interesting artistic practice, you have to keep kind of finding things that are surprising and keep expanding the range of your references. And that's, whenever I come to visit you in London, come into the shop, or, we talk about art, I'm just, I find my references expand out. I'm kind of like, oh, look at that textile, or look at that, pottery from the 30s, or look at the, how that vintage couture fabric meets this other.
But this was what happened in the 30s, 40s with a lot of artists. You saw studio images, and their walls would be filled with incredible things. And I think that freedom became a lot more conservative in the last decade. But really, it's been a pleasure for me to ask you these questions and just to try and communicate some of the things that come into your thought process when you're working.
Thank you.
And
can we have the next, maybe, just as
an ending
image?
I was going to
talk
say
about encounters and collisions.
Exactly. A great way to end is one of Glenn's probably best-known works, the Malcolm X.
But maybe, since we've talked for almost an hour, so maybe we should open questions if there are questions. I think you have to wait for the mic because it's being recorded. So. There's one in the back over there.
Okay, it's done? Cool. I was wondering about, because you're using texts that aren't your own, where do you see the role as yourself? Are you almost like a translator in changing the medium, or are you sort of taking new ownership of it?
Well, sometimes, I said once that I think of it as like the movie adaptation of a book. It's based on something, but it's something else. A text in a painting is not the text in a book, But I think text allows that kind of rereading, I did a piece recently that had lots of quotes from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and a lot of anxiety because they were from all over the book, And I was talking to Greg Bordowitz, who has fantastic essay in the catalog for Nottingham about this sense of my responsibility to this text because I was using quotes from all over the book, and they're not, people will think they're one after the other in the book, but they're not. And he's saying Walt Whitman is the poet most amenable to fragmentation. Like the mix and match, the slice, and Walt Whitman was a poet that revised his own work from edition to edition. And so I think it's, for me, I think there are lots of different approaches to text. So I feel like text is material in the world to be played with and manipulated and changed, as long as I do have a sense of responsibility to the meaning of the text, but in a way, a sort of sense of kind of trying to convey the meaning of the text is what the paintings are about. For instance, the coal dust paintings for me, the density and the abstraction in those paintings is about the density of the thoughts that Baldwin is trying to express about his relationship to European culture, his relationship to Black American culture, colonialism, dense, weighty subjects. And it seemed to me that the paintings try to, the difficulty of those paintings, the parts where they go illegible versus the parts that they're legible, is about the difficulty of trying to convey these ideas that in his essays kind of escape talking about. They're just things that are too hard to talk about. You know, language kind of fails. That's one of the things that I like about Baldwin, is that in some of the essays he acknowledges, like, I'm trying very hard to explain things that are very difficult, but language kinds of fails at moments. Things can't be expressed, you know. And so the paintings are, you know, if you want to read the essay, it's there in Baldwin, but my paintings are doing something different with the text.
Hi there. I wanted to ask a question about the video piece that you presented at the Camden Arts Centre, where there was a fragmented video of Richard Pryor. How does that inform your practice as you've presented it today?
Well, that piece came about because I was thinking about the body and language. You know, Richard Pryor's a comedian who, his routines are so much, besides, you know, he's a comedian, so there are jokes, you know, there are stories, there are routines. But he's also very physical. All of his routines involve the body. He has a tremendous ability to mimic, you know. And one day I think I was just watching, you know, sort of on a Pryor video on my computer screen, but somehow the sound was off. And I was just kind of became fascinated by his body language and the gestures, and how gestures can speak in some ways. And so that's how that video came about. So I've just, for people who haven't seen the video, it's 7 screens, and each screen isolates a piece of Pryor's body from a particular concert he did in Los Angeles. So one screen has his left hand, one screen has his right hand, one screen is a close-up of his head, one is a close-up of his mouth, one is just his shadow. And as those body parts appear in the video, they appear, in the original video, they appear on the screens. So one has to kind of keep moving around, you know, the space in order to see the video. And there's no sound too, so it's all about the kind of gesture. And it's brutal in a way, you know, it's a difficult piece, and I don't know if I've totally kind of figured out exactly what that piece is about, but I think, you know, artists make work to figure things out.
Later.
Yes, hopefully they figure out a little bit while they're making it, but often I find, you know, it's a thought process, and the pieces are thought processes, and then you make other things, you know, so it's not like I have this idea, it's all fully formed, I make the piece. No, I figure out kind of what I'm thinking about, what my concerns are as I'm making the pieces. So that piece changed radically over the course of its production. Another question there in the back.
I was just wondering how conscious you were putting together the Nottingham exhibition, that it was going to be shown to a British audience. Would this have been a different exhibition if you'd put it on in the US?
Well, it would have been a different exhibition because we were partnered with the Tate, and if it was shown in the US, we wouldn't have been. So the loans that we got from the Tate collection, we got fantastic things, which would have been very hard to get had we not had that partnership. So in some ways, you know, I wanted a Klein, there's a fantastic one here. You know, I wanted a Pollock, there's a fantastic, you know, like things happen because of this partnership. So the shows certainly, the artists may have been pretty much the same. The loans would have been different, but I think the loans being different would have changed the character of the show.
How do you think?
Well, because, it was really important for me. There are a couple of ways that this show is organized. One is around the work of artists when I first encountered them. So Steve McQueen's Bear is in the exhibition, and Steve and I were in a show together very early on when that piece was, I think, the first showing of that piece. And that had a profound influence on me. I mean, that piece I thought was an amazing piece. But, before it even went up, I thought, who is this guy who has him polishing the floors in that room 15 times? And then the piece came on, was installed, and I thought, I get it, brilliant. The video's reflected in the floor. Brilliant, brilliant. So, but I could have chosen a later Steve piece. But it was important for me for some of the choices of the show to have work from the moment I first encountered, a particular artist's work. Same with Zoe Leonard, those fashion photographs that we showed in the exhibition, in the images in the exhibition. That's when I first encountered her work, and it was at a kind of crucial moment for me when I was thinking about sort of the politics of representation, photographic representation, in relationship to a particular piece. But Bear is a hard piece to show because of the requirements for the room and the requirements for the projector. So I don't know if this show were in New York, I'm not sure, we could have shown that. So
I think also maybe he's also speaking of, in the context of the message, would your show have been different being curated for an American audience?
Well, yes, in some ways, I guess, because, but we made some decisions about the show in terms of, for example, there are lots of images of the civil rights protests in Birmingham in the 64, I think that is, and then images of the Black Panthers. So the decision there was, I was very literal about that in the beginning. I thought we have to have a selection of civil rights photographs, so sort of, as if one could represent the entirety of the civil rights movement by a selection of photographs that I could make and put in this show. And I sort of gave that up and just thought, well, audiences here know about the civil rights movement. We don't need to represent the civil rights movement. Why don't we just represent this particular moment? Birmingham protests, police using water cannons on protesters, and just have one photographer do that. In terms of the Panthers, again, how do you represent the Panthers? And I thought, let me just focus on Huey Newton. So images of Huey Newton, very charismatic leader of the Panthers, images taken of him and images the Panthers produced that used him, and sort of think about how the Panthers were portrayed in the media, but also how the Panthers portrayed themselves, focusing on this very, very handsome man, and also focusing on kind of, the underlying thing of that is that, he was a pinup. It's
advertising.
It's advertising. There's a reason why he was on so many posters, smoking the cigarette, sitting in the chair with the spear and the gun. He was fine. So, next question. Here, we have to wait for the mic.
I'm curious to know what inspired this representation of Malcolm, this particular piece.
That was a project, Malcolm X was done for a show at the Walker Arts Center in 2001. I had a residency there in Minneapolis. And the mandate around the residency was to work with communities within a 3-mile radius of the building. And the Walker, Minneapolis has people from all over the world have come there, some as refugees, a lot of it's a very welcoming city to people that have sort of flee difficult situations around the world. But I chose to sort of think about communities not in terms of ethnic groups, say, go work with Cambodian people or go, I chose to think of community in terms of age groups. So I thought, I want to work with kids, whoever they are. And I decided to do this project using these coloring books that I found in an archive in New York, part of the New York Public Library. And the images are coloring books that were done in the late 60s, early 70s, created by black educators who recognized that in the public schools, the sort of like, government schools, black history isn't being taught in a systematic way. People aren't being taught, kids aren't being taught about Martin Luther King or Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or Malcolm X. And so they create these coloring books as a way to sort of normalize these images of black heroes, basically. So the coloring books have these images of, a little boy swinging on a tire or someone combing their hair next to an image like Malcolm X. And so I take these images and I do these workshops with 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds who sort of like the age that these coloring books were pitched to, and I give them to them and let them color on them. And then I made an exhibition based on how these kids have colored these images. So this is the most problematic image, So you can imagine, I get back, I'm doing these workshops and I'm gathering up the drawings at the end, and I was like, that's an amazing image, But I realized it's also, like, in some ways, like, there's always this kind of an image of the father being feminized, Kids love to do that, And this kid, 4 years old, 5 years old, he doesn't, as much as I can tell them about Malcolm X, it's just an image to color. So I thought what was interesting about it is that the political, social agenda behind the images is subverted by the kids that they're sort of pitched to, That, but also I think this image is about how, images and icons change over time. At the moment that these images are being produced, late 60s, early 70s, Malcolm X is considered one of the most dangerous figures in American history. Now you can go to the post office and buy a stamp with his image on it. So it just tells you how icons and iconicity, the meaning of images like this change over time. And so that project was about sort of like this, lots of things, this gulf between my adult knowledge of what this image means, the importance of Malcolm X as an icon, the kids sort of disconnect with that image, but also I think larger sense of like how icons get made and remade over generations. So that's kind of how this came about. Maybe one question here, and then we should.
You don't round up your talk.
Oh, what?
The audience rounds up the talk.
If you had to create another show of things that influence you, but you weren't allowed to include artworks, what would be in it?
Well, I think I would take a page from Duro's book. There would be more textile work in it.
Like who, for example?
Well, it would be really nice to have, some of the African fabrics that we talked about. The British Museum has lots of, there's like many archives that I could have gone to for that.
The Delaunay, even, or
there's a beautiful Delaunay textile upstairs. It was made as a covering for a cradle, and incredible. It would be really interesting to think about that in relationship to G's Ben quilts, in relationship to some of abstraction. I become really interested. And, the funny thing to say these things is I'm not a scholar, so a lot of this is about, in a way, giving myself license to be a little bit ignorant of the history of all these things so that I can do some things with them, And I think I sort of give myself a license as an artist to just remain a little ignorant and to go with the instinct about what draws me to the piece rather than read giant books about the history of this,
Like a child, basically.
Yeah, like a child, exactly. No, but I think
it's
that,
great.
that you have to, in some ways, for me, you have to follow your instincts first, and then you do the research, But it's the instinctual draw to the thing for me that's the most powerful. That's how all the text in my paintings comes about, is this kind of like, why is this still in my head? You know, Steve Reich, I've listened to this for 20 years. Why is this still important? Why is this still in my head? Let me do something with this, you know? And that doing something with it actually led me to do the research on the Harlem Six. I sort of vaguely knew the story, but when I really read it, and actually got a chance to meet Steve Reich recently, and he told me more information about this case, you know. But to go back to your question, you know, I got very interested in Korean pottery. There would be representations of that in the show. There was a fantastic book I read that was called maybe Pictures of Sound, and it's basically a compendium of early ways that people visualized sound. So, you know, scrolls that were blackened with soot, and then Neil's recording sound as it, you know, as it was being played, and sort of these long strips where you're sort of literally recording sound, you know, and those would be in the show too. So there are lots of other things, you know. But I'm still like kind of interested in this idea of making a show where things touch. No museum is not going to let you do that.
No, the insurance won't let you do that.
The insurance alone, you know, but anyway. So yeah, but I would expand it'd be really interesting to do another kind of project like this that expanded into more sort of objects that don't come from the art world.
The institutional art world.
Yeah. Can I stop now?
There's one lady up there, but I think you can. Are you going to give her a chance? A quick
if
question?
there's one more question, we'll
Just
take the
one
last
more,
question.
These people have paid money,
there.
Glenn. This is
It's
this
in
is
the
a
back.
real gig.
There. In the back.
Right in the back, yeah. It's okay, no? Just one more.
Yeah. It's drink time, though. Sorry.
In your show in Nottingham, I was kind of expecting as well a piece by Kossuth. Probably I might be wrong. So I was wondering if, like, Joseph Kossuth's practice or more strictly conceptual art of the 60s in a way are referential or influential for your work, or on the other end, not at all.
Sorry, who was the artist you were expecting?
Joseph Kossuth?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Or more conceptual,
I don't like his
1960s conceptual.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, he's an important artist. I just don't like his work.
No, you don't not like his work. It's not part
I'm not
of.
interested in his work.
Glenn.
I'm not interested in his work.
It wasn't part of your thought process at the time.
Yes, it wasn't part of my thought process at the time. Exactly, Dura.
This might be a good way.
Yes, this is a good place to end. Thank you.